My last video, in which I explained why economists are so opposed to the economic agenda of Donald Trump, I said economists judge the economic performance of presidents much differently than people do. Now, hat tip to everyone who pointed out to me that I was basically saying economists aren't people. That's a cell phone, but I'll take it. It's actually kind of true. And then I was asked for examples of how, the economic actions of one president either, sabotages or gives a windfall to a president that follows. So I'm going to do one from Clinton and one from Bush. I'm going to do two bad decisions, just to give you an example of how this, bill can come due at the wrong time. So stick around, whatever your preference for the other one. All right, first, Clinton. When Clinton was in office in the late 1990s, he had taken charge of the presidency at the end, kind of 20 years into a long era of deregulation. Starting in the late 1970s, the United States started to greatly reduce the amount of regulation over certain industries in favor of business having more room to operate on, to grow and to operate and to innovate, and all these arguments that are made for deregulation. Well, the trade-off for deregulation is that you have more risk. And his head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, an agency that you probably have never heard of, was a woman named Brooksley Born. She was a lawyer. She was incredibly sharp. She was very good at her job. And she noticed that kind of at the, in this like tail end of let's deregulate everything all of the time era that America had been going through, there was a market for over-the-counter derivatives, an incredibly complex financial product that is basically, we ended up calling it in common parlance a credit default swap, but it is a kind of non-reported market trade of debt and risk, that this unregulated market was a contagion for risk. And not only did the federal government have no idea really how large it was, but who the actors were, it wasn't clear that banks themselves knew just how much risk they were exposed to through this market. So she proposed a rule, a notice of a rule. She didn't actually enact the rule. She didn't say she was going to do it. She put out a kind of a notice of rulemaking that the Commodity Futures Trading Commission would like to start collecting information on over-the-counter derivatives markets. Really basic things like who did you give it to? How big was it? And the day that she released this notice of rulemaking, she kind of, four men wrote a letter in opposition to her. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, the secretary of the Treasury, Richard Rubin, his deputy, Larry Summers, and the head of the SEC, Arthur Levitt. And their letter was, it was nice enough, but it was pretty terse, and it came to the conclusion that, she's stupid and she doesn't know what she's talking about. That these financial markets are self-regulating, that they're a way to minimize risk, not spread risk, and that to regulate it would stifle financial entrepreneurship and innovation in America and possibly move the market overseas. Ironically enough, while this is happening, and she's in this public fight about whether or not to trade derivatives, a major hedge fund fails. It's called the Long-Term Capital Management, LTCM, and at the time it had $4 billion in assets and was leveraged to the tune of over $1 trillion. And it had a massive derivative portfolio. And a lot of the banks that were exposed to this failure through the derivatives they held had no idea the extent of the concentration of risk. So all of this is happening at the same time, and Congress and the presidency and the rest of his administration come down hard against her. And they even pass a law in Congress saying that she is not allowed to investigate or regulate this, financial market. Well, you probably all know how the story ends. Within 10 years, she's proven right in a truly horrible way, as the over-leveraged banks, mainly through the unregulated and opaque market for over-the-counter derivatives, crashes the U.S. economy in the worst recession since the Great Depression. There is a financial crisis. There's a housing bubble. There's a foreclosure crisis. We lose jobs for years, and it takes almost 7 to recover from the hole left in our labor market. It was a horrible decision to essentially tell banks and investment banks that they have free reign to trade this unregulated financial product that had already proven to be risky. It was a bad decision, and it came due at the tail end of 2008, right as the presidency was changing over from Bush to Obama. And this all happened during the 2008 campaign. I don't know if any of you remember that. But that one, you can watch a PBS Frontline if you like that documentary news show called The Warning. And it is all about Brooks Lee Bourne versus these four men. And I would say their interviews after the fact are incredible. Like there's an interview in the program from Arthur Levitt who's like, well, maybe if she had been nicer, we would have been able to work with her. But they basically were all wrong. And most of them were able to admit it. Like, we were wrong. This was the bad decision and she was right. And we kind of called her stupid for it, but it's her fault for being mean. Great job, Clinton. That's a bad one. And that came due, and that absolutely marked kind of Bush's economic legacy and Obama's economic legacy, that this is what they had to deal with. All right, so now let's talk about W. There is a mythology in the Republican Party that, they are the party of tax cuts and that tax cuts grow the economy. And this mythology is credited to Ronald Reagan, but it is not. It is actually the product of George W. Bush, who passed two massive $1 trillion tax cuts while he was in office. Now, while it is the case that Ronald Reagan had a massive tax cut when he became president in 1981, it was devastating to federal revenues. I mean, it cut federal revenue by almost 10% within 2 years of being passed. And even though Republicans were like, surely spending will be cut somehow, the opposite happened, and they ramped up spending and deficits exploded in the early 80s. So while it is true that Ronald Reagan cut taxes in 81, he also raised them in 82, 83, passed a revenue neutral tax reform in 1986, and then raised them in 87 as well. Did I mention 84? 82, 83, 84, 86 neutral, 87 raise. HW raised taxes in 1990 and Clinton raised taxes in 1993. The reason why the US's deficit turned into a surplus and their debt was starting to decrease at the end of the 20th century was because Congress had restored revenue from where this 1981 devastating tax cut had brought it so low. So then, faced with a surplus upon entering office, W campaigns that money belongs to the American people. And it's better for the economy to have lower taxes. And we have 4 times over the past 20 years devastated the tax revenue of the federal government, created massive deficits and a massive debt under this myth that all we have to do is cut taxes and the economy will be fine. It wasn't true until Bush decided to commit to it in 2001. The reason why this is so risky is that it puts Social Security at risk. Social Security is one of Congress's largest creditors. Social Security has lent Congress trillions of dollars in its collected surpluses so that when Social Security has lower revenues and higher bills to pay out, right now, Congress has to pay that money back to Social Security. Rather than taking the surplus, sorry, try to put this in your mind. I'm in charge of the federal government. I have the largest and most important social program in U.S. history. It is the pillar of economic security, and I am aware that in about 20 years, I owe it somewhere between $3 and $4 trillion. So I also have on the other revenue stream an excess surplus. Al Gore said we should put that excess surplus into some kind of lockbox to pay down Social Security when it came due. Bush instead cut revenues, and now, 20 years later, when we have put over $8 trillion into tax cuts that absolutely do not grow the economy, we now have the trillions of dollars that Social Security is owed coming due, and we are going into Social Security's revenue trust fund depletion, basically at the weakest fiscal state that the U.S. has been in probably 50 years. We are actively bankrupting our own revenue stream just as Social Security needs us to step up and do this fiscally relevant thing. I am so worried that the biggest bill that George W. Bush's, zealous dedication to irresponsible tax cuts will be is that it will ultimately lead to massive cuts in Social Security. And that is a bill that I hope doesn't come due. But if it does, I will point to him and say the modern mythology that tax cuts cure everything do not come from Reagan. They come from Bush, and it has been devastating to our federal budgets, and it will be devastating to Social Security if we fail to have an adult step up and say, you can't cut taxes for free.